Hey there. So I was going to review what to do with babies with flat heads. So my wife and I, we have two kids, and the youngest he's 10 months now, and he has a flat head. And we took him into some place, and they were kind of recommending getting a helmet, and they said he had very severe, basically flat head. I think it's more like moderate, maybe severe, but so I started doing a bunch of research, and I kind of wanted to just share what I found. I still am not 100% sure, kind of everything, but from the research I'm doing, basically the thrust of it seems to be that a lot of this flatheadness will just go away on its own, it seems, and it's unclear to me how much these helmets help. And I think there's some stuff that kind of suggests they don't help. And so the big the big things I looked at, and again, I'm just a software developer, so I really don't know anything about this, but this would just be like my first kind of glance of the research papers that have been out there, and just kind of my intuition, and just thinking about this. So I guess broadly speaking, the big thing that I want as a parent is to make sure that, I don't want his head to be flat for his whole life, if we can prevent it. If we can't prevent it, then, if there's nothing we can do to help it, then, we can't do it. I can't do anything to help, so it doesn't really matter. But if there is something to help, I would want to do it, just so he doesn't have a flat head, even if it's just cosmetic. So I'm looking into this, and it seems like, so this came out in like 2016, and they basically are like kind of recommending, I guess, helmets for kids. There's like a final recommendation or something. I think basically they recommend helmets if your kid has like a certain level of severity, but I don't. I don't know. Let me see what their final recommendation is actually. Recommendations. Helmet therapy is recommended for infants with persistent moderate to severe plastiocephaly after a course of conservative treatment. Helmet therapy is recommended for infants with moderate to severe presented at an advanced age. So basically, yeah, I think they're basically making a recommendation to use the helmet with moderate to severe flathead, I'll call it, at an advanced age. But I guess I kind of disagree with that. So they have all these studies that they looked at, and by far I think this is by far the best study that I've seen, because the thrust of what I found is this: all these studies, I looked into a number of them, and only one did like a true double blind where they took like basically 40 kids with flat heads, or they took 80 kids with flat heads, split them into a group of 40 each, and they 40 wore helmets and 40 didn't, and after 2 years there was no difference. Basically there was no difference in how flat these kids' heads were, and that's the only double-blind study that's been done. And so it's a little bit in my head that's kind of the baseline standard that somebody has to prove isn't real in order to make helmets make sense. And it's also kind of weird because that's the only double-blind study that was done, and it showed it clearly showed no difference after 2 years. Their basic theory was that the helmet helps. The basic picture here that I think is probably correct is the helmet will reshape the head, especially when the baby's very young, like under 6 months. I mean, they get a flat head from sleeping on one side, so presumably putting pressure on the head will reshape it. So the helmet does reshape the head, and like all the, especially when they're young, all these, there's a lot of these studies that they don't do any sort of double blinds, but they'll just look at kids that used helmets and kids that didn't, and they'll treat them for like either 4 or 6 months with the helmet. We'll just say like 4 months, and they'll measure the improvement after the 4 months of both the groups. So they'll measure the improvement of the group that wore the helmet and the group that didn't wear the helmet, and they don't always measure at the same time in a lot of these studies, but in all those studies you see that right after the kids wear the helmet, the babies' heads will be more normal than if they didn't wear a helmet. In other words, the helmet does reshape the head, but then this study kind of shows that, yeah, but when you take the helmet off and they continue to develop, for example, after 2 years, what happens then? And in this study, they did that 2 year. They measured those kids' heads after 2 years, and there's no difference. In other words, it seems like the helmet doesn't make a long-term difference, which is, as parents, the thing we really care about. The only thing that made me a little suspicious is in this study, which is kind of in my opinion, would be the gold standard study, because it's the only double-blind controlled study that was done. They took measurements at 8 months and 12 months and 2 years, but they didn't publish the 8 months and the 12 months data. So we can't really see, because we should expect to see at, for example, 8 months, the kids started, in this study, the kids put the helmets on at 6 months. And they wore them for about 4 months on average. They're supposed to wear them for 6 months, but a lot of the parents in the study were like, screw it. And after 4 months took the helmets off. And so if they have those 8 month and 12 months data, you could really see if the helmets were improving, and then did the control group catch the helmet group after the 2 years? Because there's some possibility in this study that they just used crappy helmets. And so that's the main concern. But so the only study that I found that did any sort of long-term would be this study and one other study. But before I talk about the other study, I will say one other thing that makes me suspicious that helmets help, which is that it should be fairly easy to show that they do help. You just do this, like a lot of people were critical of this study, saying that they used bad helmets, I think. But like all you have to do is, this study was also done in 2014, just do like the same study and use good helmets and show that they work. I mean, there's so many kids in helmets, it seems like it would be fairly easy to show that they work. And I do feel like lack of evidence here is actually evidence that the helmets don't work, to be blunt. Just because there'd be so much monetary interest in having these helmets clearly work. Because as a parent, if this double-blind controlled study came out differently and was like, yeah, these helmets are helping these kids, I would pay a decent amount of money to get a helmet. I think a lot of parents would. So to me, it really feels like, I don't know. It feels like the lack of evidence is kind of pointing in a certain direction. And then all the rest of these studies, frankly, are the same or similar thing. They're what I was talking about before. They take a set of patients with a helmet and without a helmet. It's not a controlled double blind. So it'll be like they just will look at kids with and without helmets, and then take measurements. But again, they always take the measurement right as the helmet is coming off. And so it's very clear that the helmets do reshape the head. The main question is, do the heads just pop back to whatever they were going to do anyways? And all these studies will show a similar thing, that the helmet does reshape the head. So that, I mean, it's kind of good to know. And so then the only other study that's interesting. Also, I did email these authors to see if they had if they will provide the 8-month and the 12-month data, because if they have that data, and you can see that the helmets did improve initially, and then their heads just developed how they would anyways, then it's very clear what's going on. If the helmets didn't improve initially, then this study to some degree is probably not good. It probably means that the helmets were bad that they used. But I suspect that that's not the case, because the study seems they like did a pretty good thorough job. And at the time, all the other helmets were working. Like, so in 2014, like this study, for example, was done around the same time. I think the helmet was roughly the same type of helmet. I don't think they used like a extra special helmet, and it works. I mean, it showed, yeah. Yeah, they had better improvement. So the only other study that's interesting that I found would be this one. So this is a 5-year follow-up study. And again, it's not double-blind, but they looked at kids with helmet versus no helmet, and the numbers are a little bit small. The numbers are a little bit small in the real double-blind study too, which is unfortunate, but they're probably big enough to give you an idea. And so here's another study. So again, they only had 24 kids in the non-helmet and 34 in the helmet, but they took measurements at 5 years, and there's two different things they measure: the CPI and the ODDI, and I'm not exactly sure honestly what they are. I think one's more related to placencephaly, and one's more related to this one, brachycephaly, and yeah, there's just two different metrics of how misshapen your head is, basically. And here in the paper they kind of summarize it as though like using helmet, and so they're breaking it down. They did physical therapy, and they also had the helmet, and so they kind of break it down by helmet with physical therapy, helmet without physical therapy. And to me, I look at these numbers and I basically see only one trend, which is that the kids' heads are getting better on their own, is the thrust of what I'm seeing here. And the helmet is probably not doing anything, is what I'm seeing here. Although they managed to make it look like there's some statistical significance when you use helmet versus no helmet. If you look at, for example, just the CPI metric, which is apparently a little bit different a metric than the ODDI, it's very clear that the helmet does nothing. And in fact, it shows a minor, it actually shows that having no helmet is a little bit better, but it's actually not a little bit better. It's just that, and you can see here the kit. So to give you a rough idea, the CPI, a normal CPI is basically like below, I think it's like below 90 or something like that. So these kids only have their CPI is only a little bit high, frankly. It's like, I guess they're over 90, too much is crooked head. Under 90, you're fine. Maybe it's 85, but either way, it's like this. Over 90 is a little high on the CPI. So what you can see here is the kids with the helmet started at 91, and no helmet started at 93 on the CPI. So the kids with no helmet were actually a little bit higher on the CPI, and then they dropped down to 86, and that drop is actually relatively more than a 91 to 85 drop. But again, this is almost certainly just because they started higher. In other words, if your head is more crooked, you have more room to improve. And so you can see this is the relative CPI after 5 years. You can see the improvement here is a little bit more. They improved by 6.9% with no helmet and 6% with a helmet. So in other words, they're improving a little bit more on the CPI difference if you don't wear a helmet. But that's honestly just like some randomness in the data. It's basically it's more or less the same thing. The reason you get slightly more improved, this is basically the same number, but the thrust of this is the improvement comes from just growing up as kids. It doesn't come from a helmet on the CPI. Now on the ODDI, which is like a different metric, there's like maybe they can show a slight improvement with the helmet, but I almost think it's almost certainly just because the kids with the helmet had started out at a higher ODDI, because they go from 108 to 85, or sorry, 108 to 105 ODDI, and the kids with the helmet go from 106, which is lower, to 103. So again, without the helmet, they ended up lower, but this with the helmet, this change is relatively larger. But again, to me, these numbers are basically like the theme here is growing up helps your head go to a more normal shape, but the helmet really doesn't, or not substantially, anyways. Or I should say, at least, it's not clear that it does. You can see the relative ODDI here is higher, 3.1% with the helmet. In other words, it's improving more with the helmet, but again, this is almost certainly just because it started out worse with the helmet. It's it's the inverse with the CPI. The CPI, it improves more without the helmet, but again, that's almost certainly because it's starting out higher. In other words, the more flat the kids' head are, the more room there is to improve, and these numbers are just the rest of it just kind of uninteresting, and the only real trend we're seeing is time improves the flatness of the head. That's how I would interpret this. So I guess the thrust of what I see here is, and also I looked at a few other things. Basically all the other studies are just are flatness. It's basically just looks at how the helmet, if we'll look at a kid, it's 6 months, we put the helmet on him, and we look at him 6 months later, you'll almost always see that the helmet improves more than no helmet. But again, that will only be within the period where they wear the helmet. So it seems like after you take the helmet off, the kid's head just starts to grow in their normal direction anyways. And so kind of the thrust of what I'm seeing appears to be in that direction. The only way I think my analysis could be wrong is if in this study they used bad helmets, and we could see that if I can get the information about their what happened after 8 months in this study. If the helmets didn't help after wearing them for like a few months when they took that measurement, then they were using bad helmets, because other helmets are making a difference. But this study is more or less in line, in my opinion, with this, which is like basically showing that it doesn't matter too much. There's no like numbers here that are jumping out to me screaming that the helmet is helping. If anything, these numbers to me kind of show that the helmets don't really help. That's what I'm seeing here. And also these numbers are frankly a little bit hard to interpret because the groups are starting with different scores, so it's hard to know how much is just because you're able to improve more because your head's worse. So these numbers are really hard to interpret, but I more or less, to me, the thrust of this is helmets aren't doing much. What else is there to say? Anyways, I guess that would be my basic takeaway. I think we're not going to do a helmet for Brooks, our 10-month-old. He's also like age might play a role in it. It might not. That's a whole nother confusing thing. But I mean, either kind of the helmets will help these kids long term or they won't. And from what I'm seeing, they won't. Or they certainly obviously won't. And in my head, it's like they told us he'd have to wear this helmet for like 4 months, basically 24/7. He gets 1 hour off. And there's also some negative, like, it kind of sucks just to have to wear that helmet all the time. I'm sure it would annoy him. Sometimes they get itchy heads. also just kind of sucks. You like feel like poor little guy has a helmet on. It's annoying. So I want to see like some very clear, obvious evidence of this stuff working. If you're gonna slap your kid in a helmet for 4 months, I mean, I would hate to wear a helmet like that. I'm sure he gets used to it to some degree, but in my head, I would want to see like some real clear, like obvious evidence that these helmets really make a big difference in the long term. And if there's not that, well, doesn't seem to make sense. But yeah, everyone can obviously do their own research. And if this study emails me back, I'll write a comment or something on this video, because it's not still 100% clear to me that the helmets don't work, but like the thrust of what I'm seeing is that they more or less don't work long term. So just want to share this out there, because I was thinking for my own kid, I was like, well, if these helmets aren't working and other people, so many kids are wearing these helmets now, especially in America. I think in other countries it's much less common, but I was thinking like all these poor kids having to wear these helmets, and like it's harder to snuggle with your little babies and stuff. It just seems not good, especially if they don't work. So I wanted to make a YouTube video on it. All right, bye for now.